Electricity is cheaper to produce than it's ever been. Solar costs have dropped 90% in 15 years. Battery prices keep falling. So why are your bills still going up? This isn't a prediction, it's what the data already shows. The answer isn't solar, it isn't batteries, it's how the system prices electricity. And that structure changed completely between 2023 and 2026. What used to be predictable is now volatile. What used to be flat rate is now time-based, and those shifts completely rewrote the economics of home energy. Today, I want to test whether zero electricity bills is actually possible, or whether it's just another promise that breaks under real-world conditions. Over the last 3 years, time-of-use pricing has expanded rapidly across the United States. What used to be a niche tariff structure is now the default in California, Texas, and parts of the Northeast. That shift changes everything about how home energy systems behave. In many Tier 1 markets, electricity prices now spike during narrow 4-hour windows, sometimes reaching 3 to 5 times the overnight rate. Those peaks didn't exist a decade ago. They weren't part of the original ROI calculations. And once price volatility enters the equation, static systems stop making sense. What used to be a simple generate and use setup has turned into a timing problem. The question is no longer just, can I generate my own power? It's become, can I store it, shift it, and deploy it precisely when it matters most? This next part is where most explanations quietly fall apart. At the center of this is something called load shifting through distributed storage. In simple terms, it means capturing energy when it's cheap or free, either from your own solar panels or from the grid during off-peak hours, and releasing it during the expensive windows. But there's a constraint most people miss. Every storage cycle has losses. Batteries degrade, inverters waste heat, round-trip efficiency is never 100%. So instead of asking, can solar plus storage eliminate my bill, the better question becomes, under what conditions does the math actually work? The answer depends on 3 variables. First, the spread between peak and off-peak prices. If the difference is only a few cents per kilowatt hour, storage doesn't pay for itself. But if peak rates hit 40 or 50 cents while overnight rates stay at 10, suddenly the arbitrage opportunity becomes real. Second, system sizing. Oversizing doesn't always help. In fact, it often makes worse. And third, degradation over time. A system that looks profitable in year 1 can quietly turn into a liability by year 8 if the capacity fade isn't accounted for up front. Here's the key insight. The technology isn't the bottleneck. Price structure is. To test this properly, I built a simplified household energy model. It assumes a moderate-sized home in a California-style time-of-use market. Daily consumption averages 30 kilowatt hours. Solar generation is sized to match annual usage, about 10 kilowatts of panels. Storage capacity is 13.5 kilowatt hours, roughly 1 Tesla Powerwall equivalent. I used real 2025 price data from PG&E's EV2A rate schedule. Peak rates during summer evenings, 46 cents per kilowatt hour. Off-peak overnight rates, 16 cents. The system is configured to prioritize self-consumption first, then charge from the grid during cheap windows and discharge during peaks. No subsidies, no optimistic multipliers, no assumptions about perfect weather or ideal conditions. This is where most calculators fail. They ignore degradation and seasonal mismatch. The goal wasn't to maximize theoretical savings, it was to see whether over a 15-year period, a household could realistically reduce its grid dependency to near zero, and whether the economics actually support that outcome. This next part is where most explanations stop being intuitive. At first glance, the numbers look compelling. In the first year, the system offsets about 92% of grid purchases. Monthly bills drop from an average of $210 to around $18. Most of that remaining cost is fixed charges, transmission fees, grid access fees, not actual energy consumption. So yes, under ideal conditions, you can get very close to zero. This is the mistake everyone makes. They assume year 1 performance lasts forever, but that's not the full story. Once you account for battery degradation, the curve starts to bend. Lithium-ion cells lose roughly 2 to 3% of capacity per year under normal cycling. By year 8, the usable capacity is dropped to about 75% of its original rating. That means fewer peak hours covered, more reliance on grid power during expensive windows, and a slow creep back toward higher bills. By year 12, monthly costs have climbed back to $60 or $70, still far below baseline, but predictable and manageable. This degradation curve is the most important part, because the system doesn't fail suddenly, it fades, and if you're not monitoring capacity over time, you won't notice the shift until your savings have already eroded. There's also a second effect most people ignore: seasonal mismatch. Solar generation peaks in summer, but in many climates, heating loads peak in winter. Unless you have a massive oversized array or you're in a year-round sunshine zone, winter months will always pull more from the grid. That doesn't make the system worthless, but it does mean zero bills is seasonal, not permanent. This leads to the first major trap. Most people assume that if they size their system to cover average daily usage, they'll eliminate their bill, but averages lie. What actually matters is peak coincidence, whether your generation and storage align with your highest cost consumption windows. A system that looks perfectly sized on paper can still leave you exposed if your evening usage spikes right as your battery hits its discharge limit. Here's what installers won't tell you: overbuilding often makes worse. The second trap is adding more panels or more storage without understanding curtailment. If your battery is full by noon and your home isn't using power, the excess generation has nowhere to go. In many markets, feed-in tariffs pay only a fraction of retail rates, sometimes as low as 3 cents per kilowatt hour, so you end up giving away your most valuable resource. The real constraint isn't hardware capacity, it's control logic and time alignment. Ignore that, and what looks like energy independence quietly turns into wasted potential and accelerated wear. Here's the mental model that fixes all of this. A better way to think about this is not as a gadget problem, but as a load-shaping problem. The goal isn't to generate as much power as possible, it's to minimize the cost of the power you can't avoid buying. When you frame it this way, the technology starts to make sense and the decisions become much clearer. For example, instead of sizing storage to cover your entire evening load, size it to cover your peak coincidence window. That might only be 2 or 3 hours. The rest of the night, off-peak grid power is cheap enough that self-discharge losses aren't worth it. Similarly, instead of maxing out your solar array, size it to avoid curtailment. In most cases, that means targeting 80 to 90% of annual usage, not 120%. The best systems aren't the biggest ones, they're the ones designed around price arbitrage, not energy independence as an ideology. And once you optimize for cost avoidance rather than total generation, the return on investment improves, often dramatically. So yes, in 2026, near-zero electricity bills are possible, but only when the system is designed around time-of-use pricing, not around eliminating every kilowatt-hour of grid dependency. The difference matters. One approach is pragmatic and cost-effective, the other is expensive and ideological. Most households will never reach true zero, but they can reach something better: predictable, low-cost energy with built-in resilience during outages. That's the real value proposition. In the next episode, we'll look at vehicle-to-home integration and why it's becoming one of the most underestimated tools in residential energy management. Not because it's new, but because the economics just crossed a threshold most people haven't noticed yet. This channel exists to do what most energy content doesn't: explain how these systems actually behave, not how they're marketed. If you want to understand energy the way system designers do, not how it's marketed, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Microgrid Mindset.